In the mountains of Red Hollow, in a year the maps barely remembered, a woman's name appears again and again in the church book. 5 times it is written, in careful, steady handwriting. 5 weddings, 5 funerals, no children listed, not one. The neighbors whispered about the quiet after the first husband left the valley. They remembered the second wedding, how the pews were full, but the air felt heavier than it should have. By the time the third brother's name appeared beside hers, people spoke in half-sentences and stopped mid-thought when she passed by. Some said the house had a rhythm all its own. The creak of the floorboards, the small shadows in the corners, the hum of voices that weren't there. Others said the woman never looked startled, never panicked, never called for help. She moved through the days as if counting each one carefully, measuring what could be seen and what should be kept hidden. And when the last brother was buried, the house was still warm. No one remembered the first sign, the last cry, or the quiet steps she took in the night. They only remembered the book, the repeated names, and the empty line under children. 5 marriages, 5 funerals, 1 woman, and a valley that never forgot. Before the ridge falls fully into shadow, take a moment with us. Like this story, if the rhythm of Red Hollow has caught your attention, subscribe to follow more tales from Appalachia and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's remarkable, the way these mountains reach far beyond their stones and trees, stretching across valleys, towns, and even oceans, touching wherever you are. Red Hollow was a place the maps skipped over, where the ridges pressed close, and the valleys seemed to hold their breath. Families settled here in scattered homesteads, each house built from the same rough timber, and each hearth burning with the same cautious vigilance. A place where words traveled slowly, but eyes and ears did not. The woman arrived in the valley long before the first wedding. No one knew where she had come from. She carried herself with quiet certainty, with hands that could read, write, and count, an unusual skill in a place where the law was as distant as the nearest town. She did not speak more than necessary, but she noticed everything, and the valley noticed her. The first brother came to her one summer morning. He was steady, strong, with a smile that hinted at humor, but left little warmth. Their wedding was simple, held in the small wooden church at the top of the ridge. Neighbors gathered, whispered blessings, and left with the sun at their backs. Life seemed to continue as it always had. Months passed, seasons shifted. But the first brother, he faded from memory almost as quietly as he had lived. Illness, some said. Others thought it was work in the woods, accidents that happened to men alone in the timber. No one questioned it aloud. It was easier to let the story settle into silence. The second brother, younger, quieter, arrived with the same polite insistence. It was as if the valley had decided that one marriage was not enough. Their union was marked by few words, a short service, and an exchange of promises that sounded ordinary, but felt heavier to the neighbors who lingered outside the church doors. And the woman, she moved as she always did, composed and careful, measuring every step, every glance, every word. The midwife who delivered the valley's children said she never looked startled, never panicked. She seemed to inhabit the house with a careful rhythm, as if it were both a refuge and a place that demanded constant attention. By the time the second brother had settled into the household, the valley began to speak in hushed tones. Windows were closed a little tighter, doors latched a little more firmly, and the wind seemed to carry the sound of questions that were never asked. People noticed small things, the dog refusing the back room, the fire burning longer than it should have, shadows where no one stood. No cradle appeared in the house, no children, only quiet. Only the turning of pages in ledgers, the writing of letters, the careful tending of fires, and the steady, unreadable presence of the woman who carried the names of 5 brothers beside her own, and left nothing under the line that should have marked what comes next. And the valley watched. They watched as the days passed, as the first leaves fell and the snow arrived, as seasons stacked one on top of the other. And all the while, the house kept its own rhythm, and she kept hers. And no one in Red Hollow could say for certain what it meant, only that the names in the church book were written 5 times, and that the line under children remained empty. The house where the first 2 brothers lived with her was not large. It was built from the trees of the surrounding ridge, logs hewn roughly, corners fitted by hands that had worked their entire lives. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the chimney, though sturdy, sometimes whispered smoke back into the rooms instead of carrying it away. She entered that house with a quiet authority, the way someone might step into a place they had measured in their mind long before their feet touched the floor. Every door she closed, every drawer she opened, she moved with care, as though testing the strength of the walls and the sound of the floorboards beneath her. The neighbors said the house felt alive in ways they could not name. The front porch seemed to settle differently, depending on who stepped across it. The fire in the hearth would burn steady when she tended it and sputter when she did not. Sometimes at night, those who walked past the house swore they heard soft footsteps moving across the floor above, though the rooms were empty. The valley itself seemed to respond to her presence. Windows were closed tighter, shutters fastened in a way they had never been before. Dogs would bark at nothing, then run to the door and whine for her. People whispered when she passed, not of fear alone, but of uncertainty. It was a presence that could not be explained, yet no one doubted it existed. The first brother fell ill within months. No one recorded the illness in detail. He lingered in the house, tended by her hands, watched by neighbors who were careful to keep their distance. The valley accepted what happened quietly, leaving the family alone. There was no outcry, no judgment, only a slow recognition that the ordinary rules of life here were different. When he died, the funeral was brief. The church was packed, but the pews were tense, as though every person present feared saying the wrong thing. And when the grave was filled and the dirt pressed down over the coffin, the house seemed to settle even further into itself, absorbing the weight of what had happened. The second brother married her not long after. It was not uncommon in the valley for widows or widowers to remarry quickly. Survival demanded it. But this marriage, though ordinary in ceremony, carried with it a quiet weight. People noticed small things, the way she arranged the firewood, the way the wind caught in the cracks of the cabin, the way her eyes seemed to measure everything in the room before she spoke. She moved through the house as if aware of every corner, every shadow, every sound. The midwife, who had delivered most of the valley's children, said she never saw the woman restless or frightened. She was always precise, always watching, as though the house itself demanded that attention. And yet, there were signs. Small, almost imperceptible. The dog would not enter the back room. The fire would burn longer in the kitchen than anywhere else. Footsteps seemed to echo where none should be. Neighbors passing by reported a silence so thick that even the wind sounded muted. No children were born. No cradle appeared, no tiny clothes, no laughter of small voices in the halls. The line in the church book under children remained empty, a space that seemed to stretch wider with every passing season. By the second winter, the valley had grown quiet around the house. People stopped lingering at the edges of the woods, stopped delivering bread or tending livestock near the path. Those who walked past it at dusk quickened their pace, not out of fear alone, but because the house demanded that they respect the rhythm of the life within, or at least pretend to. And she remained at the center of it all, moving through the rooms with a calm precision that neither startled nor comforted. She was aware of everything, yet revealed nothing. A presence that was careful, measured, and unyielding, yet somehow impossible to define. The church book, which recorded the marriages and the absence of children, became a focal point of gossip. But no one could explain it. 5 names written beside hers. 5 weddings. 2 gone husbands. No children. And yet the woman remained, as steady as the ridge that rose behind the cabin, as quiet as the snow that settled on its roof each winter. The valley watched. The river carved the stone beneath it. The pines swayed with the wind. And all the while, the house held its own rhythm. The woman held hers, and the names in the church book waited silently for anyone willing to read them properly. Winter had loosened its grip, and the snow that once blanketed the valley had begun to melt, exposing the crooked paths and deep ruts worn into the soil by cart and foot. The house sat at the edge of the ridge, dark against the early sunlight, and from the windows, the woman watched the valley wake. People in Red Hollow spoke less often of the first brother. He had existed once, then ceased, leaving behind only his name in the church book and the faint memory of his voice, now carried only by the wind that crept through the pines. The second brother remained, but there was a stillness about him, a kind of careful attentiveness, as though the air around the house had changed since the first wedding. The neighbors noticed small things. A candle left burning too long in the window. Footsteps in the snow that stopped before the edge of the property. The dog that barked at nothing, then ran to the porch and whimpered. Children were hurried indoors when she passed, and men spoke in half words when her name arose in conversation. Whispers traveled the valley, carried along fences, through the pines, over the creek. People asked questions in hushed tones and never received answers. Was she afraid? Or was she aware of something the rest could not see? Had she always known that these names would appear beside hers in the church book, that the line under children would remain empty? The house itself seemed to take note of every passing day. The floorboards groaned, as if remembering each person who walked upon them. The fire in the hearth responded to her movements, burning steadily when she tended it, faltering when she did not. Windows rattled with the wind and settled quietly when she approached. The rooms seemed aware of her presence, listening, waiting. By the third wedding, even the valley had grown cautious. No one lingered near the edges of the yard. Livestock were moved away from the front path. Travelers passing through hurried along the ridge, speaking little and keeping their eyes on the path ahead. And yet, she remained at the center of it all, moving through the house with calm and measured steps, each one deliberate, each one careful. The third brother arrived in the spring, when the rivers ran full from melted snow, and the valley still smelled of wet earth and thawing stone. His wedding was quiet, barely a ceremony, more of a note in the ledger than a gathering. People attended, mostly out of habit, but left with a sense that the house had changed again, that the air inside had grown heavier, though no one could say why. And the woman. She continued as she had before. Hands precise, gaze steady, voice controlled. She tended the fire, sorted the wood, swept the floors, and moved through her days as though each motion were a question that only she could answer. She spoke little of the past and never of the future. Yet the valley noticed the absences. The third brother's presence was fleeting. One morning, he did not appear at the fields. One evening, he did not return from the woods. No one saw him leave, and no one saw him come back. The midwife remarked upon it in passing to neighbors. Gone as if the wind took him, and the valley murmured agreement, though their voices carried unease. People began to measure the woman's days by what they did not see. The unmarked graves in the small cemetery, the empty line under children, the way she walked through the house as if it were aware of her, as if it could judge her movements and adjust accordingly. Windows rattled at night, doors settled on their own, and shadows stretched in the corners where no shadow should be. The whispers grew. From the edges of fences along the creek, from neighbors peeking behind shutters, they began to speak of her in ways they had never before. Not as a woman, not as a neighbor, but as something larger, something that occupied the house and the valley in equal measure. They did not know what to call it. They only knew they could not turn their backs when she passed, and still she remained. 5 names beside hers, 5 marriages, 1 line left empty, and the valley, quiet and watchful, waited. They waited for what they could not name, for what might come next, for the rhythm of the house and the woman to reveal itself. But the rhythm never faltered. It continued, slow, careful, measured, impossible to decipher, leaving only questions in its wake. By the time the 4th brother arrived, the valley had grown accustomed to the presence of the house, as if it were something that belonged more to the land than to the people who lived within it. The house had a rhythm now, subtle but unyielding, that every neighbor could feel. It breathed with the comings and goings of the woman. It shifted with the seasons, and it waited. The 4th brother was unlike the others, softer spoken, careful in his movements, almost hesitant when he stepped through the yard. The wedding itself was quiet, held in the same small church at the top of the ridge. No one sang loudly that day. No voices carried laughter. And yet the congregation was present, though they whispered among themselves, trying to measure how the woman's life had settled into something they could not name. In the house, she moved as always. The fire in the hearth burned steady. She swept the floors, tending each plank as though it remembered every step ever taken upon it. She arranged the rooms with a precision that felt invisible, yet absolute. Doors closed with a measured cadence. Windows reflected light in careful angles, and shadows pooled only where she allowed them. The valley noticed the subtleties. Livestock avoided the path to the house. Dogs barked at nothing, and children were hurried indoors when she appeared. Even the wind seemed to shift around the structure, whispering through cracks in the roof, through the spaces between logs, carrying questions that went unanswered. And the 4th brother, he did not linger long in the valley. Days passed, weeks stretched on, and he took on the rhythm of the house almost immediately, moving silently through rooms, stepping lightly over boards, never leaving a sound that could be traced. Neighbors began to notice that the garden she tended flourished as it never had before. Crops grew steady, fires burned consistently, and the house itself seemed calmer, quieter, as if the rhythm she set could be absorbed by anyone who entered. But still, the line under children in the church book remained empty. and still the valley murmured quietly when her name arose. They spoke of her in ways that hinted at fear, curiosity, and awe, all tangled together. They could not name it, but they felt it, the way the house seemed to hold its breath whenever she moved from one room to the next. The fourth brother, unlike the others, appeared to understand the rhythm of the house. He followed it, moved with it, and yet even as he lived within its walls, there were gaps in what the neighbors observed. Windows would rattle lightly at night, doors would close without wind, and shadows would shift along the walls, lingering longer than they should. The people of Red Hollow began to say less, noticing only the movement of her hands, the settling of the floors, the quiet cadence of life inside the house that seemed always to be aware of who walked there. She, as always, revealed nothing. She tended the fire, swept the floors, and moved with a precision that made the house feel alive. She watched the fourth brother with the same steady gaze she had shown to the first, second, and third. She listened for the rhythm of his steps, the angle of his shoulders, the sound of his voice when he spoke. And the valley could not tell whether she was cautious, calculating, protective, or simply following the way the house demanded she move. Outside, the valley continued its quiet life. People measured the passing of days by the sun on the ridge, by the water in the creek, by the whisper of the pines. They watched the house, but the house watched them back in ways they could not understand. And in that quiet, the story continued. 5 weddings, 4 present husbands, 1 woman, and a line beneath her name that remained empty, stretching wider with every season. Spring had returned again to Red Hollow, and with it came the 5th brother. He arrived with cautious steps, a stranger even within the family he was born into. The valley watched quietly as he made his way along the worn path to the house, eyes lowered, hands steady, shoulders measured. The people who had lived alongside these walls for years paused to observe him, though they could not have explained why. Something in the house had changed since the first wedding, shifted with every passing season, and now it awaited him. The house, as always, was quiet, absorbing the steps of the new arrival. Doors settled as he moved through them. Shadows stretched along the walls in ways that seemed to follow him, but not with malice, only awareness. The hearth burned steady, the windows reflected the sunlight at careful angles, and the floors creaked only when it suited the rhythm of the house. The valley, by now, had grown accustomed to silence. They spoke less about the first, second, third, and fourth brothers. They observed the house from a distance, noticing small things. The way the dog refused to enter the back room, the pattern of smoke from the chimney, the way the wind bent around the corners of the cabin. Their attention was a quiet presence, a reminder that this story had been growing in the valley for years, and that it had taken root in ways the people could not fully name. The 5th brother entered the house carefully, as if he understood the rules unspoken, the rhythm he could not see. He moved with a precision that almost matched hers, following her gestures, the way she measured each step, each task, each motion of the day. And yet, even as he entered this rhythm, the valley noticed differences. Windows rattled without wind. The hearth burned differently, depending on who tended it. Shadows lingered where none should have fallen. People began to speak again, quietly, in the way they did when an event exceeded explanation. They murmured about absences, who was missing, who was present. They noted the empty line under children in the church book, and felt its weight deepen with each passing season. They whispered of doors closing too slowly, of footsteps in the night that were heavier than any single person. And yet, They could not say what it meant, only that it was real and that it belonged to her. She continued as she had for years. She swept the floors, tended the fire, measured each corner of the house, and watched the fifth brother with the same steady gaze she had given the others. The valley could not discern whether she was cautious, protective, curious, or merely aware of the house and its silent ways. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who understood the rules of a place that had never been written down. Outside, the valley held its breath. The rivers carried ice and branches. The wind swayed the pines. The sun fell across the ridges. And the house continued its rhythm, and she continued hers. The fifth brother moved through the rooms carefully, yet even he could not erase the history written in the walls, the floors, the hearth, the windows. 5 weddings, 5 brothers, and a line under children that remained empty. And the valley continued to watch, quietly, unsure of what was expected of them, unsure of what was coming next. And in that quiet, the story pressed forward. Shadows stretched longer. The wind whispered differently, and the valley learned once again to notice the things that could not be explained. Footsteps where none should fall, doors that moved without touch, and a presence that seemed to measure every breath and step taken in the house that had long since become more than its walls. By the time the fifth brother had settled into the house, the valley had grown quiet in ways that were not natural. People walked the paths more carefully, keeping their distance from the cabin on the ridge. Livestock avoided its shadow, as if sensing something in the air they could not name. The wind carried questions that no one dared speak aloud. And then, small absences began to appear. The first brother had been gone for months before anyone noticed how long he had been missing. The second had disappeared quietly, and the third even more so. But the fifth's presence highlighted the gaps more than ever. Neighbors began to notice missing tools, livestock wandering back late from the fields, letters that were never delivered. They could not say who was responsible, nor did they know if it mattered. The house seemed to measure everything and decide what was allowed to remain in view. The woman continued her quiet vigilance. She tended fires, swept the floors, prepared food, arranged wood, and moved through the house with precise attention. She measured each movement, each glance, each sound, as if counting steps in a rhythm only she understood. She watched the fifth brother carefully, as she had the others. She seemed aware of what the house remembered, of what the valley remembered, and of what should never be recorded in the church book. The neighbors whispered to each other, speaking in half words, glancing toward the house from behind fences or shuttered windows. No one dared speak directly of what they thought had happened inside. They spoke instead of the wind, the pines, the shifting shadows, the long nights when no one could see the fires flicker within the house. Children were told to avoid the paths that led there, and even grown men hurried past without glancing up at the ridge. And yet, the house held its own rhythm. Doors closed with precise timing, floors creaked in measured ways, and shadows lingered in corners as though listening to the conversations in the valley. The woman walked through all of it with quiet awareness, never startled, never revealing alarm. She measured the day by what could be observed and what should remain unseen, moving with careful steps through the house that had become a place of memory, record, and silent order. The fifth brother adapted to the house as best he could, following her gestures, moving along with the rhythm she set. But even he could not account for what happened when the wind shifted in particular ways, when the hearth burned differently, when shadows stretched where none should have been. The valley began to notice that patterns were forming, though none could define them. 5 weddings. The men had come and gone. The line under children remained empty. And yet the house, and she, endured, measuring all, revealing nothing. And so the valley continued its quiet observation. Every movement, every glance, every shadow cast by the afternoon sun across the ridge was noted, though no one knew why. The house had become a pulse in the landscape, and she its steady heartbeat. People spoke less of the past, and more in muted tones of what might follow. They felt the rhythm she set, even when they did not understand it. The quiet stretched across the valley like a tide, and the story pressed forward, measured, deliberate, impossible to decipher. By now, the valley had become attuned to the rhythm of the house. Every season, every day, every movement within its walls seemed to leave a mark that only those paying close attention could perceive. Livestock grazed carefully, keeping distance from the cabin. Travelers passed quickly, glancing briefly at the ridge, then looking away. And the neighbors, those who lived near enough to notice, spoke less and watched more, measuring the passage of days, the changes in the shadows, the behavior of the woman who had lived through 5 weddings, and the absence of children. There was a pattern now, subtle and slow, woven into the very fabric of the valley. People began to notice that none of the brothers had lingered long after their weddings. Absences appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly, and yet each one left its echo. The first brother faded from memory. The second left quietly. The third's disappearance was barely remarked upon. The fourth settled for a time, but the rhythm of the house seemed to absorb him, just as it had the others. And the fifth, well, the fifth moved through the rooms with an awareness that matched hers, and yet the valley could not discern whether he would remain or vanish as well. The woman maintained her careful presence at the center of it all. She moved through the house with deliberate precision, tending fires, arranging wood, sweeping floors, preparing meals. Each motion measured, each glance calculated, as if she were aware of every eye on the ridge, every footstep on the paths below, every whisper in the woods. She observed the fifth brother as closely as the first, second, and third, but revealed nothing. Not fear, not amusement, not suspicion, only attention, calm and steady. The neighbors could not name what unsettled them. They spoke of the house in muted tones, of the doors that seemed to close by themselves, of the hearth that burned differently depending on who approached it, of shadows that lingered longer than reason allowed. The valley felt it collectively, a quiet tension that could not be explained and could not be ignored. As the seasons turned, the absence of children became more pronounced. The line under her name in the church book remained empty, stretching like a silent testament. The valley whispered about it, though few dared speak aloud. Questions formed in half-sentences, left unfinished. They wondered if the house itself had claimed them, if the rhythm of life here was something no outsider could understand, if the woman at the center of it all had learned something that others could not. And yet, life in the valley continued. Work in the fields, tending the livestock, the coming and going of neighbors, all persisted under the quiet weight of observation. People measured their own days by what they could see, what they could hear, what could not be explained. And in the center of it, the house held its rhythm, and she moved within it, constant and deliberate, leaving the valley to ask questions they could not answer, to feel unease they could not name, to witness a pattern they were not meant to fully understand. The rhythm was undeniable. The pattern was present: 5 weddings, 5 brothers, and yet the line beneath children remained unfilled, stretching wider with every passing season. The valley watched, waiting for a clue, for a slip, for an answer. And the house, the woman, and the rhythm of both continued, patient and unmoved, leaving only whispers, shadows, and the slow turning of days. Years had passed, and the valley had grown used to the presence of the house and the woman within it. Yet no familiarity could dull the quiet weight that hung over the ridge. Each season pressed forward as always, but the rhythm of the house had settled into something deeper, something the valley could sense but never name. The 5th brother moved through the rooms carefully, following her gestures, walking with a precision that seemed learned rather than instinctive. The neighbors began to notice changes in him, small adjustments in posture, the way he spoke less and observed more, the way his footsteps aligned with the cadence of the house rather than the natural beat of the valley. They whispered that he had adapted to a rhythm no one else could measure, a pattern that had shaped the lives of the brothers before him. The valley's whispers grew more deliberate. People spoke of absences more often than they spoke of presence. Tools left in fields, letters never delivered, livestock returning late, shadows that moved when no one was there. Each observation was a piece of the story the house told quietly, a story that existed beyond words, beyond record, beyond explanation. And the woman, she continued as always, steady, precise, aware of everything yet revealing nothing. She tended the fire, arranged wood, swept floors, watched the 5th brother, and moved through the house with a rhythm that had become almost impossible to separate from the structure itself. Her attention measured each step, each shadow, each sound, ensuring that the house and the valley continued to move in concert, even as questions lingered, unanswered. People in Red Hollow began to reflect in hushed tones. They spoke not of guilt or wrongdoing, but of inevitability. 5 weddings, 5 brothers. A line left empty beneath the name in the church book. The house had shaped them all, absorbed their presence, and left the valley with only fragments of memory. Children were warned about the paths to the ridge. Travelers hurried past. Neighbors averted their eyes. And still, the woman remained, silent, steady, and immeasurable. The house, too, had changed. Its creaks and groans became deliberate, almost like punctuation in a long, unspoken story. Shadows stretched across walls differently. Fires burned in varied rhythms depending on who moved through the rooms. And the wind seemed to bend around the structure, as though carrying messages only she could hear. The rhythm of the house was not just movement. It was a presence, a pattern, a memory that outlasted its occupants. And the valley noticed, quietly, patiently, carrying the weight of observation as each day passed. They could see the continuity of her presence and the absence of the brothers who had once lived within the walls. They could sense the rhythm, the unbroken cadence of life within the house, and they understood, without ever naming it, that some stories are written not in words, but in the way houses breathe, shadows move, and seasons turn. The 5th brother, finally, became part of the rhythm without fully understanding it, and the valley, watching silently, realized that the pattern had become complete, not in the way they had imagined, but in a way that the house and the woman alone could measure. 5 weddings, 5 brothers, 1 line left unfilled, and a rhythm that outlasted all observation, leaving only questions, shadows, and the slow turning of days that no one could fully decipher. Time stretched differently in Red Hollow after the 5th brother. The valley continued its quiet routines, but no one could forget the rhythm of the house, nor the presence of the woman who moved within it. Years had passed, and the house had become more than timber and stone. It had become a measure of time, a witness, a silent ledger of life, absence, and careful observation. People spoke less of the brothers now, but the story lingered in every corner of the valley. They spoke of 5 weddings in muted tones, each one leaving a mark the mind could trace, though the hand could not write. They remembered the line under children that remained empty, stretching like a quiet question that the world could not answer. And they remembered her, moving steadily, carefully, as if she alone understood the house, the valley, and the unseen patterns that governed both. The house held all of it in its walls, the comings and goings, the silence after departures, the subtle adjustments of light and shadow, the creaks and whispers of timber. She moved within that rhythm, aware of its memory, and the valley watched from a distance, uncertain whether she had made it or it had made her. The answer did not matter, and perhaps it never would. Travelers passing by noticed the ridge, the quiet presence of the house, the stillness that hung over the yard, and spoke of it in the next town with a mixture of awe and unease. They never knew her name, but the story of 5 weddings and 1 empty line followed them in conversation, growing with each telling, stretching across ridges and rivers like a shadow without shape. And the woman, she remained, as steady as ever. Seasons passed, fires were tended, floors swept, windows cleaned, and the house continued to breathe with her movements. The 5th brother adapted as best he could, the house accepting him into the rhythm, though no one could say for how long. She never faltered, never wavered, and never revealed what she knew, what she understood, or what she measured. The valley understood only what it could see. 5 names in the church book, 5 weddings, a single line left unfilled. It understood the quiet presence in the house, the pattern of shadows, the careful steps across creaking floors. And yet, it understood nothing of the truth, of the why, of the manner in which the rhythm had shaped life within those walls. The sun would rise over the ridge, fall over the pines, and the house would stand quietly, a measure of time, a keeper of secrets, a witness to what had passed and what would never be recorded. And she would move through it, steady and unbroken, leaving the valley to remember only the echoes of footsteps, of fires, of shadows that lingered, and of a line left empty beneath her name. 5 weddings, 5 brothers, 1 woman, 1 line. And the valley, silent and watchful, realized that some stories do not end. They simply continue in quiet observation, in shadows, in patterns, in rhythms no one fully understands, leaving only questions, whispers, and the slow turning of days that will always carry their weight. If the quiet of Red Hollow left you wondering, if the rhythm of that house and the line left empty beneath her name still lingers in your thoughts, then you're not alone. Subscribe and turn on notifications to walk with us through more stories that hide in the corners of history, where shadows, secrets, and unanswered questions remain. And if you know someone who would pause and listen to the whispers of the past, share this story and let them feel the rhythm too.